Well, hello. My name is Aaron Burke, professor of Near Eastern Archaeology and the Archaeology of Ancient Israel in the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department here at UCLA. I welcome you today to this winter 2021 series sponsored by the Alan Levy Center for Jewish Studies entitled The Bible and the Ancient World. And I'd like to thank Sarah Stein, the director, for supporting this and giving us the opportunity to bring in some individuals who maybe in broader Jewish studies circles will only be heard by archaeologists on occasion. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to widen that out and give the broader community the opportunity to hear about archaeology, ancient history, and Hebrew Bible, and how these come together in such a wonderful way to illuminate various topics. Today, our speaker and individual with whom I'm going to enjoy having an opportunity to chat after this session to answer some questions. And if you are attending and wish to put a question in the chat, we will entertain those towards the end of the talk. Today, our guest is Erin Darby. Erin is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Tennessee, where she began her teaching career in 2012. She graduated with her PhD in religious studies with a concentration in the archaeology of Israel from Duke University in 2011. She has received fellowships from the State Department Educational and Cultural Affairs Research and the National Endowment for the Humanities for her work at the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem that is so familiar to many of us who work in Israel in archaeological and Hebrew Bible circles. Dr. Darby is well known for her work on Judean pillar figurines, cultic figurines from the region of Judah, predominantly dated to the 7th century BC. This culminated, aside from a number of articles that others may be familiar with, in particular culminated in her publication of her PhD research in a book entitled Interpreting Judean Pillar Figurines, Gender and Empire in Judean Apotropaic Ritual, published in 2014 with Moore Seebeck. It's a very important publication, and these are a very important data set, as we'll see, I think, in part of our conversation today, as we talk about ritual and religion. Erin is also the co-director of the Ein Gerendal archaeological project, excavating a Nabatean Islamic period, Nabatean to Islamic period site in southern Jordan. And she's leading the University of Tennessee DIG Jordan Study Abroad program, which, as I can tell you, having done this through UCLA, is an enormous amount of work. And that's much credit to Erin to organize all of the jots and tittles that are required to bring together such a program. Most recently, she has also begun work on the sort of purported Edomite shrine, and those are her words, not mine, concerning this cultic complex in just south of Judah or in the territory of Judah, the sort of frontier land in the Negev, at the site of Inhatsev in southern Israel. And this is really kind of our jumping off point today for her lecture. And I'll turn it over to Erin. Erin, I have to apologize. I don't have the title of the lecture in front of me.
Don't worry about that. We'll get there. Thanks to everybody for having me as a guest. I was just saying when we were chatting before that we began that I also have some administrative positions. And so it's kind of a joy to be able to take some time and talk to an audience, whether you're here today or you're going to watch this later, and colleagues about the actual research that I enjoy doing. So with that, I will put up the PowerPoint so that I also can remember the title of what I came up with. So let's make sure we have it here. There we go. So what we called it, we went through a lot of titles, but we came up with a Judean, an Edomite, and a Negevite walk into a shrine, which is my attempt at what my friend would call levity. And what we're really going to talk about, we're going to use the site of Inhatsev and a few other sites, and we'll talk about where they are in a minute, to think about the archaeology of religion and ritual, and whether we can, or to what extent we can connect that with ethnicity or political identity, because that's a really tricky thing to do if you're going to try and be really careful with your archaeological data. And this research has been supported by a number of entities. So in addition to thanking UCLA for having me today, I also need to acknowledge the support that I've had from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Tennessee, the Israel Antiquities Authority, and of course the Albright Institute itself. So All of those things are what enable us to have this conversation. All right, so just to get everybody in the right space in their head, I wanted to situate us geographically. So we're talking about, we're in, of course, this is the land bridge that many of us call the Southern Levant, modern day Israel, West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Egypt. And we're interested for our purposes in our little lens in this part right here. So we're looking at what is today Southern Israel and Southern Jordan. And we're going to spend an awful lot of time thinking about this little dot here called Inhatsev, but we're going to bounce around a bit in our conversation. So for those of you who have a background in the archaeology of this particular area, in all periods in Israel, the material culture of the Negev, especially in the southern part of the Negev, is different from the rest of the country. I know Israel's not a very big place. You can drive it in only a few hours, but in terms of what the pottery looks like and the iconography look like and the systems that connect sites in every period, starting in the early bronze, well into the Iron Ages, we're going to talk about today, there's a sort of cultural horizon of southern Israel that's a bit different than central and northern Israel. So this is a challenge that archaeologists struggle with in many, many different periods. How do we make sense of this big old desert region, which actually constitutes multiple different desert ecosystems? So if you're looking at the rock formations or the land in the Israeli Negev, it's quite different from what you have in the Wadi Arava. And the geological formations on this side of the Wadi Arava, where my cursor is actually quite different in some ways from the construction of the mountain systems and geology on the Jordanian side of the Wadi Arava. There are differences in how the sand is carried down the Wadi systems, even in this little slip here that we call the Wadi Arava, this broad, flat valley system that stretches from the Red Sea in the south to the Dead Sea. Here, you have multiple sub-ecosystems. So at the site that Aaron was talking about, I direct, that's primarily a Roman fort at Ein Gerendal, we have a dune steep. Whereas if you were to drive an hour south and end up at not far from like Kibbutz Lotan on the Israeli side, you'd have salt mudflats. So even within the Wadi Arava, you have microclimates. So this is actually a really interesting and complicated area of Israel that we're going to look at today. Even more complicated when we scoot back in time to the Iron Age, which is where we're headed. So for those of you who don't have a sort of background in the issue, and I'll get to that in a second in the slide, I just want to give you a sense. This border between modern Israel and Jordan was not there in the same way in the ancient world. So in the Roman period, if you wanted to travel from the Roman port of Isla up towards the route that took you over to Gaza, you actually ping pong across the valley system following the water resources until you can catch some horizontal paths across southern Israel or up over into Jordan and northeast. So we work at a site, a Roman site on one side of the valley, and all the sister sites most of them are on the Israeli side of the valley. In the Iron Age, it's the same sort of problem. There's no hard and fast border in between these, what is today two modern nation states. So if you really want to understand the problem about who lived where and what political alliances and what ethnic identities they have, you have to work on both sides of the border. And there's some challenges with that. Some of the struggles that we see in the research on the Hebrew Bible side and in the archaeology side, sometimes different groups of people. Some people tend to focus on the Israeli side and some people tend to focus on the Jordanian side. But if you want to understand ancient Edom, you're going to have to be able to work across those borders. And so that's a modern day way that the challenges attendant to modern state development is sometimes make it hard to do the history that somebody like Aaron or someone like I do. All right, so moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about the archaeology of ritual and ethnicity. We're going to use this site I just showed you, that little dot at the site at Inhatsev, to think about these things. And these are some of the issues that we want to keep in mind as we proceed. We'll talk just a tiny bit about what the biblical text has to say about this area, but we're going to focus on the archaeology. And what do we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about the archaeology of this region? A lot of problems. So we're thinking about how we as modern interpreters look at ritual objects, what meaning we bring when we're interpreting them. We have to think about our own preconceptions about ethnicity and religion. So when we use words like ethnicity or identity, what do we mean? And what are we actually looking for in the material record? Can it answer the questions we have? We have to think about whether ancient religion can really be associated with one ethnic or political group, or whether it's way more complicated than that. And a lot of times we know our own lives. We know that religion in the modern world or in our own lives is really complicated. But standing at this distance from the ancient world, we tend to kind of homogenize and generalize. And somehow then the thing that comes out the other side is less complicated than what we know it must have been. So we're going to think a little bit about that. And then finally, the quality of the data in the study of material religion is just a fancy way to say, when we're thinking about the materials that make up ritual lives or religious landscapes, what kind of information do we need if we're really going to reconstruct these things accurately or with some level of plausibility? Or conversely, do we start with an imagined idea of what the religion or the ethnicity or the political boundary was like, and then go hunting for evidence to confirm our imagination? One of these is, the first one of these is much harder to do than the second, much more likely to end in frustration and tears, but also if we only go and find what we already determined we were looking for, then our information has no way of telling us we're wrong. So as an archaeologist, that's what I want to avoid, right? I want to let as much as possible, and I know it's impossible in an absolute sense, I want to let the data test my hypothesis, not bring all of my theories and tell the data what it should say. So with all of those challenges in mind, this is the site that we're going to talk a little bit about. This is a nice aerial view. Oh, and I should mention that a lot of the material in this lecture is unpublished. It should not be reproduced. It should not be circulated. If you have questions about the material you're seeing and you want to contact me, that's totally fine. I love to get correspondence from students and from community members, but please do not circulate what you're about to see. So this is an overhead shot of the site of Inhatsev. It is massive, as you can tell. So it's a really significant site. It's in, have you been to Israel? It's about an hour and a half, maybe an hour north of the site of Eilat, where a lot of people like to go and hang out at the beach and the mall. If you've ever taken the bus directly from Jerusalem to Eilat, it's sort of the halfway point where you stop and get an iced coffee. If you have to get off the bus, use the bathroom, get back in the bus, and you head south. It is a prominent spot on the far side of the Wadi Arava, so it has a commanding location. It is occupied in multiple periods of history. So you have Iron Age sites, you probably have some pre-Iron Age material that my colleague Tali Erickson-Guinea has been excavating, and you have a very important Roman period fort, very much like the fort that we're digging at Ein Gerendal in Jordan, overlying the Iron Age material. And I think you probably have actually a Byzantine era fort as well, but we probably won't talk about that much today. So why is this the place we're going to think about religion? Well, it's because of these scrappy little remains outside of the really impressive city I just told you about. So this is the cool, massive, it's actually two forts. There's what we call a smaller casement fort, and then it's been expanded into a larger inset offset fort beyond the original fort. Anyway, we're not going to talk that much about the actual really, really cool architecture. We're going to talk about this area on the outside of the city. Why are we going to talk about it? Because of some things that were found in this region, and then especially the interpretations of those material culture items. So here is an overhead plan. This is one of many, many plans that have been drawn as part of the original excavations. Hatzeva was excavated by multiple people. And so I won't give you the long list of who all has a permit here. This is largely reflecting the excavations done by Rudy Cohen with the Israel Antiquities Authority. This is an interpretation. All drawings are an interpretation. So anytime you see an overhead drawing of a site, realize that that's not just what was there. It's often what the excavator interprets to be the different chronological phases or the different construction phases. So keep that in mind. Sometimes when we look at excavation drawings or excavation, even photography, we forget that there's an interpretive element that's impressed upon the material. So I'm not so much interested in whether you're following along with how this particular drawing interprets the strata. That's different layers of occupation at the site. But I wanted to give you a sense of the multiple sorts of structures and why this is really hard to interpret. So this is actually a Roman bathing complex. It's late Roman. You have that little casement fort that I spoke about a second ago, probably with original gate. You have an expansion of that into a larger inset offset casement fort. Then you have two other forts. This one in the white is definitely a late Roman fort, very similar to the one we have at Garandal. And this guy over here has been variously interpreted as multiple things. This is the one I actually sort of suspect to be later, like Byzantine. The stuff we're going to talk about is extramural, so outside the site proper. And we're going to come back to this problem with the site because it impacts how we interpret this shrine site or this potential shrine. Whether or not you see this shrine as related to the people who lived here, or whether you want to read the shrine as something that was built after the people stopped living here, has an impact on how we interpret the religious objects that they found in the ritual pit outside. So we'll get to that. So this is our site that we're going to spend some time with. Why would I do this? Why would I willingly commit myself to the complete frustration of digging through other people's excavation records to try and answer questions? And sometimes I ask myself the same thing. So I will try and tell you why I think we should spend some time thinking about these questions. So there are all sorts of, there's new work, actually a lot of new work. So Aaron has a student that's just did a dissertation on this topic. There's a forthcoming book probably in the next few years by my colleague, Laura, who will be writing about this. There's an awful lot of interest in the question of what's happening in the Negev in the 10th to the 6th centuries BCE. So this roughly, and I'm especially interested in the 8th to 6th centuries. That's my area. There's questions in general about who controls the territory. Did it belong to the kingdom of Judah, or in some people's interpretations, the United Kingdom of Israel that stretched from the north of the country all the way through the south? Was it controlled instead by another polity that was outside of that territory? And the Bible sometimes uses the phrase Edom or Edomites, perhaps to refer to this area. The biblical material is really complicated to interpret, and there's a lot of great writing on the question of how the Bible's using the term Edom, and later on how the rabbis use the term Edom as well. So some people are interested in whether there's a different nation state or a different ethnicity that controls the Negev, whether it's tribal or whether it's state level formation or some combination. So if it isn't part of the Israelite or the Judahite state, is it a state at all? Is a question a lot of people are writing about. And then what impact did it have when these areas geographically were incorporated into the larger imperial powers, especially Assyria and the Neo-Babylonian Empire that follows it? And what impact did that have on this region? So broadly speaking, people write about this, especially between the 10th and the 6th centuries, a sort of 400-year window. I'm more interested in the last 200 years of that. There have been for a long time prominent theories about this little polity called Edom and what territory fell under the name Edomite. So in the Bible, especially in the Pentateuchal material, it talks about Edom and sometimes uses different language. Sometimes it uses the term Seir, and it stretches across a pretty wide swath of land. There were hypotheses, because the Edomites participate in the siege of Jerusalem with the Neo-Babylonians, that Edom sort of began in what is today modern Jordan and spread. And then there are debates about when that happened. We're going to come back to that problem here today. But the biblical text, it depends on what you're reading. In the Pentateuch, Edom/Seir is very large. In the prophets, they're less interested in, they're focused a little bit more especially on southern Jordan and on a political entity that they refer to as the Edomites. Edom shows up in the Psalms. It shows up in Lamentations. So it's in a bunch of different passages in the Tanakh. And that makes it complicated to interpret the biblical material alone, because you have to take into consideration the date of all of those individual scrolls, how those pieces of literature came together over time, whether there were later editorial remarks added to earlier material that reflect the situation, say, after the fall of Jerusalem rather than before, and how then ultimately we try and combine that information with what we dig in the archaeological record, which is where we're going to spend our time. So there's a question in trying to figure out the answers to some of those about the role religion might play. And for a variety of interesting reasons, ritual artifacts have figured prominently in some of these debates about whether or not the southern part of what is today Israel was controlled by the Judeans in the 8th through 6th centuries, or was controlled by a different group of people altogether. And I'll hopefully demonstrate to you by the end of our little talk why ritual objects became such an important part of that conversation and why that maybe isn't the greatest thing for us. So the shrine we're going to look at, the potential shrine outside of Hatzeva, is one example of at least 2 or more in the region that have been called Edomite, and basically called that primarily based on opinions about the style of artistic objects. So we're going to ask whether or not those ritual objects can actually be identified as Edomite or Judean or anything else. We're going to look at the way archaeologists interpret these artifacts in this space. So a lot of times what we excavate is poorly preserved, and we have to figure out what it might have looked like. In the case of Inhatsev, the shrine was deactivated. So whatever activity originally went on there, the area was cleaned out and the objects were buried ritually in a, it's not a pit in this case, but we'll call it that. And the word that we often use for that is a favisa. So that leaves the archaeologists with a pretty rough job of trying to reconstruct how those objects were originally used. In this case, the excavators of Inhatsev used another site in the same region as a model to try and reconstruct what they thought Inhatsev really looked like. And we'll come back to that in a second. Many theories, as I said, are based on the biblical text rather than on archaeology. And there are lots and lots of longstanding problems with how archaeologists have drawn upon the Bible and how biblical scholars have drawn upon archaeology. And the truth is, it's hard. It's hard to combine them together and to do justice to the intricacies of both disciplines. So it's not a surprise that sometimes when we try and bring the Bible and archaeology together, we're a little clunky at doing it well. So while some epigraphic evidence, that means things that have been excavated with actual inscription on them, is applicable, so in other words, we might look at whether or not the deity that we come to associate with the Edomites named Kos is inscribed on something or part of somebody's name that's inscribed on something. The non-epigraphic, that means the stuff that doesn't have any writing on it, the stuff I'm focused on, is really thin. It's not very helpful. And of those things, the 2 that come up most frequently in discussions are a thing people call Edomite pottery. Now, of course, it doesn't say made in Edom. So how do we know it's Edomite pottery? And there have been a lot of twists and turns and differences of opinion about what originally was called Edomite pottery. Some of my colleagues don't even use that language anymore. I would prefer not to use it. That's why I put Edomite pottery in scare quotes. But some source analysis, so we might take a little chunk out of a pot and look at the clay composition and see if we can say something about where the clay came from, or we might use neutron activation analysis to get a chemical signature and see if we can identify the source of the clay. Some of the pieces of material that we've called Edomite pottery in the past do seem to come from Edom, but a lot of it doesn't. So yet you'll see this phrase come up a lot in the conversations. And of course, if I excavated your house today, I imagine I would find dishes from all over the world, and that maybe wouldn't say much about your own ethnic identity. So in archaeology, you can't just jump from pots to people super easily. And the shrines show up all the time and are a really prominent part of this problem of who was in control of southern Israel in this period of history. So that's what we're going to focus on today. All right, so this is me being very silly. I am laying on a reconstructed version of the shrine site outside of Inhatsev. Unfortunately, in this case, if you visit the site, and I hope you do one day, not just so you can get the iced coffee nearby, you won't see a lot of signage that tells you that this has been reconstructed. So this is a problem at archaeological sites in general. We excavate them. As archaeologists, we often have very little left. Yet when you're preserving them for an archaeological park or visitors, you have to interpret them so people understand what they're looking at. Sometimes when we do that, we don't always give all the information you might want as a visitor to know what I dug versus what I interpreted as having been there originally that was no longer surviving. So this is, I'm laying on what they perceive to be the possibly an altar, who knows. But this is what you're seeing here is not what was excavated. I'll show you what they excavated and you'll see how different it actually was. What you're seeing was reconstructed based on something though, not just imagination, it was based on this. And we're going to come back to this plan in a little bit. This is also a reconstruction. So this is what was interpreted as having been once at the site of Horbat Kitmit. So just to keep you in mind where we are, we've got an excavation at one site that was pretty blown out. In other words, the preservation wasn't great. There was a lot of wind and rain damage. The material culture was really close to the surface, so it wasn't preserved particularly well. So they had to first interpret that site and come up with what they thought it originally looked like. And then the excavators at Hatseva took that interpretation and used it to interpret what Hatseva would have looked like. So now this is why it's really hard to kind of engage archaeology, because if you don't know what you're looking for, you maybe would have no idea that this has happened. And here is a drawing, again, an artist's rendition of what the excavators thought the Inhatsev shrine may have looked like. These stones you see, these were really excavated. They were part, they'll show you, they were part of the ritual pit. These objects were found in the ritual pit, but this sort of construction is completely conjectural. And this is what you'll see if you go to the Israel Museum. Again, this is an artist's reconstruction of what they found. So this is based on another reconstruction at another site. Why all this matters for the Edomites, I promise you we will get there. Just for now, before I continue, you can take a snapshot in your head of a few elements, but especially the sort of facial features of some of these, what we call, well, they're large figures made out of clay, but they were probably stands, offering stands, incense stands, and that's not controversial. We have plenty of these, and we'll talk about where we have them. Some of them are decorated, some of them are anthropomorphic, that means in human form. Some of them have animal images on them. Some of them are not decorated at all, or they're fenestrated, that just means there's holes in them. And that's a pretty common thing across the ancient Near East, to have altar stands or incense altars that have these windows cut into the sides. We'll come back to that. So let me show you what we're actually dealing with. Actually, we're not actually looking at what they dug yet. We're just looking at a picture. So this is a plan of what was excavated. Now, everybody see this dotted line right here? Now, if you're not an archaeologist, that won't mean anything to you. If you are an archaeologist, you know dotted line means hypothesis. That means that they didn't excavate a wall here. In fact, they excavated 3 stones. That's it. And they don't even have a corner. So the excavators hypothesized, remember that shape that you just saw in the picture from the Israel Museum and from the site? They hypothesized that this shape actually existed. So the first problem we have is that this wall isn't there. And my friend Eric Klein just wrote a book, 3 Stones Make a Wall, about the interpretation. Here you go, Eric, 3 stones made a wall. Especially in archaeology, if you don't have the corners, you really have to be careful conjecturing the shape of a building, because how do you know? How do you know that these aren't just later? How do you know that these didn't fall off of something? Without the corner here, this is pretty conjectural. But let's look at the overall image. So this is what they excavated here. This is an overhead picture of it. Remember what you saw in the Israel Museum. Remember what you saw at the reconstructed site. This is what they actually came down upon when they dug. Quite different. And here's a drawing, a stone-by-stone drawing of that. This here, so this sort of wonky curved wall, this is those slabs I told you actually came from the site. And underneath them in the crevices is where they found broken a bunch of those clay items like bowls and fenestrated stands crushed under here. So this is what is certainly a favisa. In other words, they took objects associated with some kind of religious activity somewhere, deactivated them, and put them under here. This doesn't necessarily imply intentionally breaking it. Let me be really clear, because for those of you who know your Tanakh, you may have in the back of your head cultic reforms where the kings intentionally break items. That is probably not what's happened here, or at least not in my opinion. We could have an interesting conversation about that. This is pretty typical across the Mediterranean world. When you clean out a shrine space, you deactivate. It's sort of like a geniza, right? You don't want to just throw away the scrolls. You want to do something with them after the fact. So I want to take a look at this mess. This is just tumble, right? That's on top. So how do we get from this to walls? All right. So we looked at the first very conjectural wall. Here's the second wall that they conjectured existed. This is what's actually there. This drawing has taken away all of the debris that's fallen on top of it and has hypothesized. Now look, we've got those dotted lines again. Dotted lines here. We got no rocks in the corner. We got dotted lines here. So we already know we have to look carefully at the image. So here's a number of images of the process of excavation. And you can see some of those broken cultic ceramic items underneath the stones, the slabs. And what I want to highlight in this series of images is that you actually have objects at different levels. So look, the slabs that are lying on top of the ceramic items that were the ritual items actually dive underneath the debris here. So in any of these pictures, and if you can find it, I would love for you to write me and help me see it. It's very hard for me to see strong evidence of a clear wall here. We have the collapse still remaining, but I am not certain that we can say that there's even a wall where the excavator said that there was. I think that we're looking for something. I think we're looking for something that looks an awful lot like a reconstruction from another site, and we might be taking a few liberties with the interpretation. So let's look at another example. Here's this wall back in the back. And again, we've got an awful lot of dotted lines here, so we're going to want to be careful. This is where that wall should be, and maybe there is a wall here. Who knows? The problem again is, and we're looking at what would be like this here, it's really high up. So the elevation is once again higher than the level of the favisa itself. So, and the deposition in this part, that means how much dirt they had to dig through. It's really shallow. So if I wanted to get really in the weeds with you and show you the picture of this from the side perspective of what they dug through, there's not a lot to work with. So they posit that there was a wall here, which I'm not certain I think existed, before this was deactivated. A wall that went this way and a wall that came across over there. If you're having a hard time imagining it, well, you're not alone. I do too. So this is part of the process of archaeological interpretation. But out of that, we created a hypothesized shrine. Now remember, everything you've seen is just over here. There's this whole other badly preserved structure over here that hypothetically would also be part of the shrine. But like anything else in archaeology, it's complicated. So here are two different drawings from the excavation files that show very different reconstructions of what was actually excavated. You've got extra walls on one side where you don't have over here. You've got material you have it here, you don't have it here. You've got a different relationship between multiple walls here than you have here. Why does all that matter? Well, because eventually this is going to be interpreted tentatively as part of the religious activities happening outside of the site. But we don't even actually, I don't feel that I really know at this point what was even excavated effectively. This is not an ideal setting. There are all sorts of other reasons it's not ideal. If I wanted to know if there was animal sacrifice, I really need animal bones. I need to know if there are special kinds of animal bones or special species of animals or special cuts of meat that they would have had over here. I don't have any animal bones from the site. I would want to know if there were special faunal remains, so tiny little microscopic pieces of plant item that would be in the soil. And if we sifted the soil, we would find them. We didn't do that in this case. So I don't have any faunal material from the site that I can look at, or any plant material that I can look at. There's all sorts of things that we don't have. And again, it was really shallow and close to the surface, so everything is poorly preserved. So this is another interpretation. And again, you have to think about they're dating these things. So what they're suggesting in this picture is that this wall dates to a different period than these walls, which are dating to a different period than these walls. Again, I don't want to get too nitty gritty on the dates and this interpretation here for a general audience, but suffice it to say, none of this is based on stratified as in dug datable pottery or material culture finds. The only material culture that I can find that is associated with this shrine is actually what was already published in the Favisa deposit. So all of this is based on some people's opinions of how these walls relate to each other, if we could even agree on where the walls are, but not on finding pottery that we know dates to a particular period, or seals or other things that we might use. All right, so that's the bad news. Why does all of that matter? All of that terribly boring stuff? Well, because the shrine cited in Inhatsev has been used as evidence to argue that there were definitely non-Judahites. In this case, that usually that they identify these people with the Edomites, and that they were using this site, either that they built a shrine at the site after the fort was no longer occupied or while the fort was occupied, depending on who you read. But what we actually look at when we look very closely at the archaeology is it's not clear exactly what's going on there or how it was used or what the rituals might have entailed. Now, one more piece to look at is the stratigraphy outside. So in this interpretation from the excavation files, you've got one phase. I think the small casement fort, that's our little casement fort, was built together, and that seems reasonable based on a visual inspection of the architecture. Then the expansion, and then here they're trying to say that the shrine was occupied later than the expansion. Well, why would they do that? Well, here's the problem. If the shrine belongs to the period of occupation of the fort and the shrine is Edomite, this fort is Edomite. It's a very large and important site. All of a sudden, you then have a claim for Edomite control of the territory. Not everybody's comfortable with that for a variety of reasons having to do with biblical history. And so if instead you make the argument that the shrine was used after this was no longer occupied, then you can say the shrine is Edomite, but the site is Judean. And you'll also find that in writing. Now, I went to all the trouble to show you that archaeology to show you why that is a really tenuous argument to make. And it's more driven by the narrative in the biblical text, perhaps, and assumptions about the size and capacity of the Judean kingdom than it is driven by the archaeology itself. And that's a little backwards from the way I would normally want to do it. So all of those things are part of the problem. Now let's look a little bit at the iconography. I promise this will be less detail oriented. So these are some of the reconstructions of items found related to the site. And this was not found in the shrine. This is widely called an Edomite seal. It actually has South Arabian names on it, and the iconography is at home in multiple cultural spheres. Originally, when people started writing about the site, they had found this object here, and they thought that it was a bull's horns. And some people associate bull iconography with the Edomite deity Kos. So the reconstructions focused on what they perceived to be similarities between this altar and the seal found inside the site and this inscribed limestone block from outside the site, except that when we did further inspection, it's very clear that it's roughly anthropomorphic, not bovine. So this is another good example of we're going to the site, we're looking for things we think should be there. It's impacting how we interpret the iconography, and maybe we moved a little too quickly. So in this case, using material at another site to assume there were Edomites in southern Israel, that they were religious, that this is what their religion entailed, and then going and looking for that material at Inhatsev. In actuality, for those of you who are interested, this seal comes from a terrible context. So it is one of the most important pieces of evidence connecting Inhatsev hypothetically with Edomite script, when in fact, and if you have questions about that, write me and we can talk about it. It's underneath the corner of what I think is a Byzantine tower. It's in a context that's completely churned up. So the soil isn't, like, you would not call this a clear or closed context. So it's sort of a mess. But this is one example of the way that looking for things might impact how we interpret the image of art objects. Now, I want to look at Horvat Kitmet for a second, because I've mentioned it a bunch of times. So where we're going to go really quickly is we're going to go to this site here. And this was excavated by Beit Aria before Hatsheva was excavated. And I'll show you what it looked like. There you go. It's sort of bleak and terrible, depressing. Actually, I really like the Negev. It's a beautiful place. But as an archaeologist, the preservation at Horvat Kitmet was really rough. And if you read the excavation report carefully, they'll tell you that. They're very clear about all the ways there was runoff. Things were definitely moved across the site out of their original context. The objects they found there were smashed to smithereens. Lots and lots of material, but not anything like its original either form or spatial location. This is from this. This is what the excavators came up with as a reconstruction here in the bottom left of what they had. So I don't want to get too caught up in whether or not I think this is effective or ineffective as a way of reconstructing the site. But the point I want to make is that instead of looking at the archaeological context, as in where everything was found, because it was so disturbed you couldn't, people focused on the iconography. Remember I asked you to take a snapshot in your mind of those cult stands that I showed you in the Israel Museum? Here you can see what at the time was the perception that there were some similarities in iconographic form, these sort of aquiline pronounced noses, the pointing beards, the anthropomorphic cult stands. This is certainly not even the most predominant kind of iconography at Horvat Kitmet, but there were things that at that point in time weren't actually well attested in this period. So there was a lot of attention. You have other kinds of clay objects. An important piece to remember is almost everything at the site it was interpreted by the excavators in Quebec as being attached to a cult shrine. So they weren't like, most of them weren't freestanding figurines that you might hold in your hand and walk around and do stuff with, like the other work that I do in Jerusalem. These are things that were probably all attached to some kind of cult stance. All right, so when these were excavated, there was already, remember, there's already this dominant hypothesis that the Edomites had spread from the Transjordan across today the Israeli Negev before we ever excavated anything, based almost entirely on the biblical text. When we began excavating some of these sites, especially finding these ritual objects, people thought, aha, we have an Edomite iconography. There's a style of making human forms or making objects that we can definitely associate with the Edomites as a political group and not someone else. Now, if you stop and think about that again, the jump from an object to an entire group of people is a pretty big jump for an archaeologist to make, especially when we realize that the more excavation we did, the more problematic that was. So here are a series of cult stands. You can see some of the same features, not from southern Israel, from Wadi et Tamad in Ammonite/Moabite Jordan. These all were, there was neutron activation analysis, there was petrographic analysis. Again, we're looking at where the clay comes from, and they were all found to be local. So the closest parallels to these images at Inhatsev and Horvat Kitmet were not in the center of Edom down here in Busera off my screen. The closest parallels are up in a completely different secondary state in the Iron Age, excavated by Michel Davio. So this throws a lot of things into, it just shines a light on what was already a problem. You can't simply go from a style to an ethnicity or to a political border without a lot of evidence. Now we do that in Judah with the little things I work on called Judean pillar figurines. But you've got to remember, we have like thousands of them. So there's a lot of data to work with. In this case, we're talking about a handful of objects. This is not a lot of data to work with. So it was pretty well demonstrated that you couldn't use the shape or the size or the depiction of the cult shrines or the cult objects to somehow say this must have been associated with a particular group of people or political identity. Now, here are objects that nobody has published before. These are from inside Inhatsev, including another anthropomorphic vessel/cult stand that definitely show that there's probably a relationship between the occupants of the site and what was going on in whatever religious activity happened outside the site. So it's not effective to say that somehow the shrine outside of Hatseva and the wayside shrine at Kitmet were completely separate from the people who lived in these areas. And that is what a lot of people have been claiming for a while. And the reason, again, that you do that is because there's a attempt to find the Edomites, but not to attribute to the Edomites some of these very important sites that some people would like to say are on the border of Judah rather than on the border of Edom. So here's just a good example of some of the objects from inside Inhatsev. None of these have good context, by the way. Here's another. This is a small limestone incense altar right from inside the site. Here is a tripod cup, also a common religious artifact, not published yet. All of that material, most of it was found in these areas, badly disturbed, lots of churned up soil, not associated with our shrine that's over here, right? Areas A and D, and is just testament to the fact that when we don't dig particularly carefully and we don't have a lot of data, and then we try and interpret objects, what we're really doing is we are using objects to confirm the story we've already told ourselves. We're not using the archaeology to test our hypothesis. So why does that matter for me? Well, if you had to ask me what religious or what ethnic identity is Hatseva associated with, I'd have to say, I don't think we have the evidence to know. Could it be Negevites? In other words, could it be local people who just live in this region and this is a little city center? Possibly. You can't rule out that they had some political allegiance with either Judah to the north or Edom to the east, but there's not a lot of good data that suggests that they do. So it's an open question. Not very sexy, but honest. If you ask me, does the religion that's practiced at the site give us some sort of insight into the ritual lives of Edomites? My answer is no, probably not. Especially because these sites, as many people have noted, are connected across trade routes. So if you were to come up from the Arabian trade route and across it in Hatseva and then over into the rest of the today Israeli Negev, you see all sorts of really cool and interesting objects surfacing in the Jordanian and Israeli side along these routes. Probably lots of people are traversing this area. So not so easy to go from object to ethnicity. Not easy to go from object to political identity or political allegiance. And not even really easy to tell you what type of religion or ritual was practiced at the site because of the way that it was excavated and the fact that it was taken down before and buried before any excavator ever got to it. So I don't know how satisfying that is as a, maybe we won't call it a conclusion, maybe we'll call it a beginning point. But I do think it's sort of honest about why this is really challenging. Aaron, I don't know how you feel about any of that stuff.
No, thank you, Erin. That's fantastic. I think it increasingly fits very well with the situation that, we're looking at in so many archaeological contexts where we talk about social entanglement. And it gets messy enough that it's hard to assign things in the discrete ways that they were done in the past. I mean, the interesting thing is that as much as you might feel like, am I giving a counsel of despair to the public audience that's consuming? I mean, truthfully, we're falling back, are we not, a bit, and then kind of reasserting what we can say from these situations. So I guess, dovetailing on that, you're kind of, you spend most of your time talking about the religious aspects. But I was wondering how you introduced this topic at the end there about trade. Mm-hmm. Do you want to throw out, individual names here or not individuals, but individual group names that you feel are reflected between this site and other sites as sort of corroborating these, movements and activities?
I mean, I think the movements are well attested, and that goes like the movement of goods and humans across the Negev go all the way back to the early Bronze, right? I mean, the rise of urbanization in pre-modern, really pre-modern Israel is tied in some ways to copper trade and the transportation of goods across from Jordan to Egypt. So this pattern of moving across the Negev and that giving rise to settlements, whether or not they are permanent urban centers or more pastoral areas, that's sort of, I don't know that we have to, I don't know that I have to problematize that necessarily, right? I don't want to assume everything either, but we know we have a lot of Assyrian and Egyptian documentation about the trade going across here. And I didn't get a chance to talk very much about that, but we have a fair amount of Assyrian, especially documentation about the southern Arabian trade route. And we have documentation both from the biblical text and from the Assyrians. They give us a little inkling into the kind of taxation. So why you might want to control those trade routes, what you might do with the riches that come from having those goods travel through your area. I mean, heck, in Jerusalem in the 7th century, we've got South Arabian script. We've got, at some of these sites in the Negev, we have mollusks that are sourced only from the Arabian route, right? That they're not going to end up at places like Hatzeba or Malhata on their own. They didn't walk there, right? They're mollusks. So we know that there are the movement of peoples in these established patterns. That's the whole development of the Beersheba Valley, right? That's on the other side of the Negev in this region. We've got the pottery, we've got all of that evidence. So I feel like we've got strong evidence to suggest multiple goods moving across the trade routes. Can we go from goods to individuals and from individuals to ethnicities? That's a harder one for me to come down on just yet.
Right. I guess what I found, it so happens that I happen to be doing a graduate seminar in identity. And it just so happens that this afternoon we're supposed to be talking about Edomites.
Nice.
And it just so happens we were reading about Tel Aror,
yes.
west.
So you're reading Sarah Amy's work.
Yes. And what's fascinating there is that,
they have a caravanserai.
Yeah, such a prevalence of a certain type of pottery outside the site, which presumably politically under the jurisdiction of Judah and perhaps hosting.
Right. Although I'm not, again, because I'm that super suspicious human, I'm not convinced that is demonstrating a ostracization of a different set of humans outside the site versus inside. So the interpretation of that might go a little further than I would. But you definitely have the evidence of extramural trade happening outside the city center.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, being someone who's worked a lot in the Bronze Age, I think of the, Karu phenomenon,
of course,
phenomenon in Akkadian,
right?
And wonder if that's not a nice reflection of that. I mean, indeed, when you think of different capacities in ancient Israel, different jobs or communities of practice, merchants is a difficult one. We get the prophets mentioning the Phoenicians and the Arabians, and they're out there somewhere, but we really haven't alighted upon them in an archaeological way to say not only are these people potentially Edomites or Arabians, but indeed they also seem to have been engaged as merchants in this particular location. Right. I guess what you said made me wonder if, for the first time, we might not have some inklings of Moabite merchants. And their activities passing through this fortress at Inhatsev.
I mean, so the key piece on and I look at it in the work I'm working on. I look at the cultic assemblages from Araware and Malhata as well, but I promised we do shrine, so I left those out. But the issue with the shrine assemblages in part has to do with the production lines. Right. So if the clay is primarily sourced as local, as it is in most cases, and pretty homogeneous, that is contrasted with figurines. So, for example, if you look at the petrographic work that I've done with David Ben Shlomo for Jerusalem, and David has just done another piece on Nasbe, what you're seeing is a much wider variety of clay recipes, which may mean production lines. When you contrast it with shrine deposits, where there seems to be at least the inkling of stronger administrative control over the production of the items themselves. So we know, for example, that they're not bringing the cult images from Moab and putting them, or from Ammon and putting them at Hatzeva or Kitmit. We know that they're probably locally sourced. It's harder to track whether artistic influence or artisans themselves would have traveled. The way that we talk about, say, mosaic artists in the Roman period might have traveled from synagogue to synagogue in the Galilee, and that might explain why you have some similarities in motif. It's difficult to find the artisans versus the objects.
Right.
The only thing I want to keep in mind with the shrine deposits is that the ceramic items are not probably votives. They're probably not brought there by the worshippers and left at the site. They are probably cultic furniture, produced perhaps by a designated production line. Some people would like to connect, say, Kitmit with Malhata and suggest that perhaps some of those objects could have been associated with that settlement because they're relatively close. Elsewhere, I kind of problematize, or I worry about how closely associated they are. But in that case, I'm not saying wrong. I'm just saying that in the shrine deposits, you have to ask who's producing the clay objects, what are they produced for, and are these the evidence? Another different way you might go is looking at shells, right? Because shells are certainly not being produced by the site. So shells might tell you a little bit more about perhaps the advent of Arabian traders, people who had, or whatever their personal ethnicity, people who had traveled some distance across the trade routes and are bringing items, or items are being transported by individuals across wide spaces.
So do you feel, having looked at the broader context of a place like Inhatsev, that you would, if we were disambiguating or seeking to the issue of the identity of the individuals in and through such a fortress versus who's politically in control? I mean,
right.
I'm a forts guy, so I'm looking at the lines of the fort and thinking, well, does this fit into traditions that might be associated with Judah, so on and so forth?
Right.
What's on that?
Well, and Inhatsev will frustrate you on that because there's no direct parallel, right? Like usually your inset offsets are solid, not casement. So we've got a massive expansion of a casement inset offset. It has corner towers, doesn't have interval towers. It's not identical to Khalifa. It's not identical to Nahas. It's not identical to Judah. It's sort of its own beast.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, those, you just named a couple of parallels that mostly people would consider Judean, right? I mean, generally under Judean political control.
So I guess the other piece, Aaron, that I think, because I work with identity questions in figurine studies, and one of the things I'd like us to think more about is salience. So if you're looking at psychological research on identity, and I do this in some ways because I'm also a scholar of religion that works in the modern world, so I talk about religious identity in the workplace. And if you move into psychological approaches to these questions, it's not enough just to say, do you or do you not have an identity? People have conflicting and competing identities, and different institutional structures in different places and different periods of history have different levels of salience. So even today, and Ben Porter has published a bunch of, and Danielle Fatkin have published a bunch of really interesting essays from their site in Jordan, and interviews with the local people who might think of themselves more as people who are from Debon than people who are Jordanian, right? Like their local identity might matter differently to them than their national identity. That's not to say their national identity doesn't matter, but it's really hard archaeologically to get to that granular level where we really feel like we can say something without accidentally kind of reading back into our ancient subjects.
Yeah.
And making
it's funny that you said that, because that's sort of what we, discussed as a sort of, we're beyond the halfway point in this seminar and have arrived at that place of recognizing that in so many times in the biblical narratives, what we forget about as we think about it through nationalist eyes from a very late stage is that people are identifying with towns and smaller clans rather than tribes, which may very well be fictive. And
who's to say whether somebody wouldn't think of themselves more as a Lahishi rather than a Judahite, or that they'd think of themselves as both, but one might matter more than the other, right? Or that their family name might be their primary identity.
Right. And it might matter whether you're talking about a soldier who, who's stationed in Judah, in Lachish from the Judean military rather than, a local, right?
Even though I've written about identity and figurines, I've become somewhat agnostic with myself on this particular question.
It is a challenging thing, because one of the other things that we've sort of toyed with is this question of, presentism, right? It's taking modern assumptions of things and retrojecting them, which can be the other end of sin in the world of, mental gymnastics for dealing with ancient questions.
One of the audience members asked, can I say a little bit more about why I use the word Negevite as opposed to like Edomite or Judean in the and in some ways I was being contrarian. So I was just talking to my colleague Laura about this, and there are a lot of different opinions about what language we use when we don't know what language to use. So when I ran a session with Andrea Creel, who did her PhD at UC Berkeley on Southern Israelite religion a few years ago, and Stephanie Brown from Berkeley. We entitled the session Edomite religion ? So we added scare quotes and a question mark, just like to be certain that we didn't know what to call it. Negevite would be the kind of like the chickening out version, right? I'm talking about activities that are today in the Negev. And so I'm being very non-committal if I were to call something Negevite as opposed to Edomite or Judean. In a way, I'm punting on that question. You could say, well, like Laura will, other people do. You could say, well, we're just going to say we're going to call it Edomite because that word shows up in other sources. Or like Juan Tebas does, we might want to refer Peter Biankowski. We might want to call them like tribal, right? And we might have different language we use to refer to them as tribal. It's all conjectural, and super smart people are trying really hard to come up with the right terms. So in a way, I was taking the kind of archaeology of region approach. These are sites in the Negev. Can I toss
another idea out there?
Yeah.
It's sort of like sticking the pin back in the grenade, so to speak. Is it possible that in some cases, and I'm working through this with the question of Amorites and Canaanites in the Bible, the piece that I'm working on out now is sort of an extension of my thoughts for the earlier period and how that affects, conceptualizations in the Iron Age. Can we possibly say that some of these names should probably not be regarded as ethnonyms, but maybe instead demonyms, meaning population labels, so that if we as archaeologists use the term Edomite, we're kind of using it like Negevite, and we're kind of tossing a net over an area and saying, individuals operating in this geographic region without really saying much about, their own individual identity, loyalties, or their political loyalties, or even necessarily a singular statement about their religious. What do you think about that?
This is exactly the same discussion I was having yesterday. It would depend on how optimistic I wanted to be about human nature. So I do think that using language to disrupt and trip up our assumptions is a useful method of proceeding.
Right.
Having watched the way scholars quote other scholars, and I assume your grad students have probably noticed this, even seasoned scholars don't always read carefully. They don't always read the footnotes. So things that are said maybe with the way you're describing, Aaron, could get cited in a really different way.
Right, yes.
And so I think as I was watching, and especially because when you're looking at Hatseva, there's this weird, catch-22 chasing the goalpost piece where when they're interpreting Kitmit, they relied on Hatseva as evidence of Edomite occupation. And when they were interpreting Hatseva, they rely on Kitmit. And you see the same weird circular thing with Khalifa sometimes.
Yeah.
And so because we have these citation circles, I probably want to suggest that we don't want to use words that have I probably wouldn't use a word that has a long history in scholarship meaning something else, because I don't know how effectively I'm going to get people to read it differently. And I've got colleagues who are going to try. And so good luck to them.
Well, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And I think that, with this being out there on the web, you're going to get some interactions, and we're looking forward to, seeing what those are in due course. I really do appreciate you joining us today. And I look forward to the time that we are able to have you out here in person to enjoy some Southern California sunny days in the winter.
And I put my email in the chat. So for those of you who see this later, if you want to ask questions or just talk about the material, feel free to contact me. It might take me a few days to get back, only because it's a busy part of the semester. But
yeah. Well, thank you so much again.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.